What's good everybody, this is CP and welcome to a very special video. Hopefully the next 8 to 10 minutes will help you win your fantasy leagues this year. Today, let's take a look at the top fantasy basketball players to draft for the 2022-23 NBA season. I'll try to predict some of the top players for all major fantasy categories, along with potential dark horse candidates and breakout players for each category. Starting with points per game. If we take a look at the top 10 lists from last year, I feel like most players from the top 10 last season are pretty safe picks once again this year. But in terms of risks, I think you have to be careful with players like LeBron, KD, and Kyrie, and not have them on too many of your fantasy teams. As history shows, they have missed the most amount of games over the past few seasons compared to everyone else on this list. LeBron and KD in particular are getting older, and I can see them continue to miss a handful of games, either from load management or simply from their body just breaking down. Meanwhile, Kyrie has only played more than 65 games 4 times in his 11-year NBA career. We also saw him miss a large chunk of games for things outside of basketball. Now, don't get me wrong, when playing at 100%, Kyrie puts up amazing fantasy stats, but he can also cost you in a lot of leagues if he decides to miss games at the wrong time. So be extra careful when drafting Kyrie for scoring in too many of your leagues. So if I had the choice out of everyone in the top 10 from last year, I see Giannas Antetokounmpo, Luka, Doncic, DeMar DeRozan, and Nikola Jokic as the safer choice to give you the most amount of games. Also, I want to note that one player you shouldn't forget about is Zion Williamson. He missed the entire season last year, but was actually a top 10 scorer in the NBA 2 seasons ago, averaging 27 points per game as a 20-year-old. So if he bounces back, stays healthy for a good amount of games, I could definitely see him back in the top 10 for this category, and I think he has a legit shot to set new career highs in scoring once again. Going down the list, I think 5 players with the best upside to possibly finish in the top 10 this season includes Jayson Tatum, Karl Anthony Towns, Donovan Mitchell, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and Jaylen Brown. Main reason is because all are relatively young, still in the peak of their prime, and also has the talent and upside to bring their scoring to the next level. So personally, I wouldn't be surprised to see any of these 5 names finish in the top 10 in scoring next year. In terms of bounce back players for scoring, I feel like James Harden might be my top choice. Surprisingly, he was only ranked 27th last year, averaging 22 points per game, but Harden has a career average of closer to 25. He was also caught in a messy situation early last year with the Brooklyn Nets, which might have been a huge reason why his stats didn't really take off. But I feel like he's in a much better fantasy situation in Philadelphia right now, so I think a bounce back year could be in the works. In terms of the biggest fantasy risers for scoring, my top choices would be Anthony Edwards, Darius Garland, LaMelo Ball, and to a lesser extent, Jordan Poole of the Golden State Warriors. The common thing about these 4 players is that all of them have shown year-over-year improvement in their scoring, and is just reaching the point of the career where they still might have plenty of untapped potential and hopefully have the upside to bring their scoring averages to an elite level. If all goes well, a few of them might have a shot to be a top 15 or top 20 fantasy player in the scoring department. Moving on, let's take a look at triples. Unlike points per game, I think this category is a little bit harder to predict as new players and non-all-stars emerge as elite fantasy 3-point shooters every year. If we look at the stats from last year, Steph Curry led the way along with Buddy Hield and Fred VanVleet of the Toronto Raptors. But notice how Malik Beasley and Evan Fournier were also top 5 players in total triples made last year. However, in comparison to players like Curry and VanVleet, Beasley and Fournier are much worse overall fantasy players. So in my opinion, it's not smart to reach for a 3-point specialist too early, as you can probably find plenty much later in your drafts. Also, if you want to build your team on triples and not run into the risk of having too many one-dimensional fantasy players, out of everyone in the top 10 list from last year, I feel like Steph Curry, Fred VanVleet, Trae Young, Donovan Mitchell, and Jayson Tatum would be your best bet. Not only can they knock down threes, but they're also able to provide you with above average fantasy stats in other categories such as assists, steals, and points. In terms of biggest risers in this category, I would probably have to go with Desmond Bane, Anthony Edwards, LaMelo Ball, and Sadiq Bey. All relatively young players have started to figure things out in the league and should continue to trend up fantasy-wise for the next few seasons. So in my opinion, this year would be a good time to catch one of these guys on the way up. If last year's stats gives us any indication, it is very rare to see a power forward or center in the top 20 or even top 30 in triples made. In fact, Kevin Love was the only big in the top 25 last year, making 187 triples in 74 games played. Besides that, some may make the argument that Jayson Tatum is a power forward, and you might be right on that. But the main thing I want to point out here is that if triples are important to you, then having power forwards or centers who can average around 1.3 to 1.5 triples a game could be a game changer, as those guys are few and far between. So in my opinion, if one of these unicorns emerge out of nowhere or is available on your waiver wire, it might be worthwhile to pick them up, as they could be a huge difference maker for your teams in the 3-point category throughout your fantasy season. Moving on to steals, this is another super rare category. Only 8 players in the entire NBA averaged more than 1.6 steals per game last year. So in short, if you had any of those guys on your roster, they might have single-handedly won you the steal category in a lot of your leagues last year. But notice how you can't really get the best of both worlds with high steal guys. Out of everyone in the top 8 last year, I would say 3 of those guys are not must-roster fantasy players. In particular, Matisse Thybulle and Gary Trent. In a lot of leagues, they were droppable for a lot of teams, especially if you weren't concerned about steals. Also, if you go further down the list and look at the top 20, you'll notice that many high steal guys are not well-rounded fantasy players and might actually give you below average fantasy stats in other major categories like scoring, assists, and triples. Therefore, this makes guys like DeJounte Murray, Chris Paul, Fred VanVleet, Steph Curry, LaMelo Ball, and Jokic that much more valuable. Not only can they get you high steal numbers, but also contribute in other major fantasy categories. So if you were to ask me, my general rule of thumb is that if you want to be competitive in steals, and if you see a player averaging at least 1.5 steals a game, he's definitely worth a look at adding into your roster, especially in deeper leagues where every single steal matters. Moving on to rebounds, in my opinion, this is a dying fantasy stat, as we're seeing less traditional bigs in the game and many taller guards competing for rebounds as well. Therefore, elite rebounders are becoming more rare than prior years. Only 8 players in the entire NBA averaged more than 10.5 rebounds a game or more, and all of them were natural power forwards or centers. After doing a quick search in the last several years, I found that players like Rudy Gobert, Clint Capella, Joel Embiid, and Sabonis always seems to be somewhere at the top of the list for rebounding. But I must say every year you'll see 1 or 2 new players break out in this category. If I remember correctly, 2 of the biggest risers last year was Robert Williams and Bobby Portis. But once again, this category has one of the least year-over-year fluctuations in that the usual suspects seem to be in the top 15 or top 10 every year. So unless they get their playing time significantly decreased, I really have a hard time seeing any of these guys' fantasy rebound numbers take a huge hit. So in my opinion, if you're looking for an elite rebounder, it's pretty safe to go after most of these guys on the list. 2 risers to look out for are Evan Mobley and Scottie Barnes of the Toronto Raptors. Both finished outside of the top 25 last year, but heading into this season, there's a good chance we see improvement and increased playing time. Therefore, I think both have a legit shot to break into the top 20 for rebounds per game. And also don't forget about a player like Zion Williamson. He averaged 7.2 rebounds in his second season in the NBA, and if he's 100% healthy and ready to go, I feel like he has upside to finish over 8 rebounds a game in his anticipated return this year. Moving on to assists. For those unaware, assists is one of the most rare fantasy categories out there. So if you don't draft any high assist guys with any of your early to mid-round picks, it will be very, very hard to be competitive in this category, because chances are you probably can't find much on the waiver wire in the middle of the year. If we look at last year's top 10 list, only 2 players in the league averaged more than 10 assists per game, and only 7 players in the NBA averaged 8 or more assists per game. So the stats definitely don't lie. Once again, I can see James Harden and Chris Paul both finish in the top 2 again, as those 2 guys are elite fantasy assist monsters and are literally in a class of their own. Unless they fall off the face of the earth this year, I can't see them not be in the top 10 again this year. In my opinion, Luka Doncic is another blue chip guy in the assist category, as he's the primary ball handler and playmaker with an entire offense built around him in Dallas. I think this might be the year where Doncic finally averages over 9 assists per game this season. Nikola Jokic is another special player to watch in this category. He is one of those rare bigs in the NBA that can average over 7 assists per game, and pairing him with another high assist guard might be the winning strategy to make your team overpowering in this particular category. Out of everyone in the top 7, I think DeJounte Murray and Trae Young's numbers will take a hit. As we all know, they're both now on the same team and will likely share the floor on a lot of occasions, so there's a risk for them to handcuff each other's assist numbers. In my opinion, 2 young players to look out for in this category are LaMelo Ball and Tyrese Halliburton. Both are in wonderful fantasy situations on their respective teams and are only continuing to get better as playmakers at the NBA level. If all goes well, I think they have an outside shot to finish off next season in the top 5. Going further down the list, a young player like Cade Cunningham might be good to have on your watch list, as he could take a huge step forward from year 1 to year 2. He averaged 5.6 assists last year, so the bar isn't high by his standards, and I personally think he has a good chance to set new career highs in this category, possibly closer to 6.5 to 6.8 assists per game. Finally, another dark horse candidate with the ability to bounce back is probably Russell Westbrook. He finished 12th in this category last year, averaging only 7.1 assists per game, which is very low by his standards. But you probably know he was caught in a messy fantasy situation as an LA Laker. We also can't forget that he had a career high of 11.7 assists not too long ago in 2021 with the Washington Wizards. So if the Lakers decide to trade him, or if he does not have to share the floor with someone like LeBron, then I feel like he could easily bounce back in the top 10 again. 2 rare fantasy players you might want to target for assists are Domantas Sabonis and Julius Randle. Both average over 5 assists per game at the center and power forward position. And like Jokic, these guys are what I consider fantasy unicorns and are impossible to find on the waiver wire. Moving on to blocks. It is another rare fantasy category, and only 3 players in the entire NBA last year averaged 2 or more blocks per game, which might be a little bit surprising for those unfamiliar with this category. Although he was only 3rd in the league last year in average blocks per game, I personally still consider Rudy Gobert as one of the safest and possibly the cream of the crop for this generation of fantasy basketball. For those unaware, Gobert averaged over 2 blocks per game for 8 consecutive seasons and has a career average of 2.2 blocks per game. Basically, over that period of time, I haven't really seen a player that put up similar numbers. Meanwhile, the others in the top 5 put up great numbers last year. I feel like they're less experienced and none have been able to put up elite numbers for as long as Gobert have. Zooming out more, in last year's top 10, I feel like Robert Williams and Evan Mobley has the biggest upside to consistently finish as top 10 players for the next several years, as they're both young and seem to have very defined roles on their respective teams. So if I had to choose, those 2 might be worthwhile players to target in dynasty and long-term keeper leagues. On the other hand, players like Mitch Robinson, Jakob Poeltl, Mo Bamba are still great players to roster. Not only are they great to get you elite numbers and blocks, they won't be hard to trade, especially if you have managers in your leagues looking for blocks later in the year. Overall, I feel like blocks is a very valuable fantasy category, especially in deeper leagues. As in my opinion, I don't think you should leave any guy averaging more than 1.5 blocks on the waiver wire. Worst case scenario, you pick him up and trade him to address other needs on your roster. Do you agree or disagree with everything I said in this video? Make sure you let me know in the comments below. And if you like, feel free to call me out as well. If you want to watch more of my crappy videos, then make sure you click the links on the side right here.